قسما بالله رب العالمين وارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second interview with my very interesting guest, Justice Johan van der Westhuizen, who's a former judge on the Constitutional Court. In the previous interview, we spoke much generally about the judge's role as an academic and, of course, the face of transformation in South Africa. Now I want to interrogate Justice van der Westhuizen a little bit more about some of the very pertinent details. Good day, and thank you very much again for being here, Justice, and for making this time.
Thank you.
So, when we concluded on the last show, you spoke specifically about the notion of change and that change is inevitable. But if change is inevitable, why is it that we struggle so much in terms of the law to bring about change? I mean, one of the things I know that's a sticking point is African customary law. Right, and many lawyers, and there's a radical mindset now within the academia. You said the academia needs to bring that transformation, needs to bring the change to help the judges in order to visualize. I know you've been described as a judge who looks at the big picture, not just the technical details. If we're not going to look at just the technical details, we want the big picture. Why is there such a resistance to African customary law?
Well, if I go back to the time when the Constitution was drafted, interesting, the liberation movements, there were two phases with the drafting of the Constitution. The interim Constitution at Kempton Park, yes, and then the final Constitution in Cape Town. And people, the same activists who called for radical change generally in the first round, for example in criminal law and criminal procedure, who wanted, because many people in prison were politically there for political reasons, or at least socio-economic reasons and poverty and so on. So one tried then to fight for the maximum rights for accused persons, right, for example. It was very different, the whole atmosphere in the second round, because the governing party, the liberation movement, the main one, the ANC, was now the governing party. And they were responsible for what could be called law and order or safety and security. And therefore they were much stricter on allowing guilty people to walk free. Before I come to customary law, it was a big battle. Everybody agreed that we should have socio-economic rights, rights to housing and water, yes, and healthcare. But when it came to the enforcement, when somebody proposed from the University of Pretoria, by the way, that we give the Human Rights Commission the power to monitor that once a year, there was great resistance from the governing party. And they said, maybe it's become true, they said opposition parties will use the independent institutions like the Human Rights Commission and the Public Protector to embarrass them. Now, customary law, I was actually, quite frankly, surprised that it got very little attention in the final round. At the first one, I was not on that committee. I was at the first drafting. I chaired a committee that had to abolish apartheid legislation and any of the so-called security legislation that could be an impediment to free elections. Right. In the second one, the leader of the ANC in his negotiation team was a minister, a Muslim, very well known at that stage. And from him and others, there was actually little interest in customary law. There were delegations of traditional leaders, etc. But one of the reasons was people were, I'm working on my own memory now, and somebody else might see it very differently, but I think one of the reasons is the women's lobby, many people were worried about the patriarchal elements of customary law. So even when the clauses like 31 were written into the Constitution, which every time when culture came up or religion, there was a big pushback about people should not use custom and religion to justify discrimination. Of course, right-wing white people could use it and say, our church, don't think that black people are humans or whatever. But the same applied on the other side. So there was a great hesitance. People tried to steer away from issues about marriage, polygamy, all of that kind of stuff. The politicians tried to get things through. There was a deadline. They needed 2/3 majority. And in a way, they passed that on to the courts. Chapter 12, which deals with customary law and traditional leadership, is very, very short.
Okay.
There's very little in it. So those cases started to come to court. A famous case of the court is Behe, B-H-E, which had to do with inheritance and male primogeniture, for example. So that was dealt with by the court, but it was a long and difficult judgment. One of my judgments dealt with whether the people themselves called themselves a tribe, and we didn't use the word tribe and chief and so on in the judgment, but from Limpopo, the question is whether a woman could be the chief of a tribe.
Okay, right.
So I gave that judgment, and using the Constitution, not customary law, we said whatever the customary law was, one should be able to adapt it in view of the Constitution. So the woman became the chief, as far as I know. She was, by the way, a former ANC member of Parliament. So these kinds of histories also sometimes come from these kinds of disputes come from a long history of succession and who was replaced by who, etc. We've had cases which in the Constitutional Court, which I found very hard in a constitutional democracy, about also leadership of a tribe, which went back to the spear and blood rule of 1860 or something.
Wow. When
one brother chased another one away by throwing, and then the Boer Republic got involved. Half of them were co-opted, supported by General Piet Joubert of the old Transvaal, and the other half by the English. So the whole thing got very messed up in terms of their normal line of succession. So it will be an ongoing debate how to bring customary law in, or how to change the law to accommodate customary law. But in my memory, now that you ask it directly, and I was planning to write it one day, very little attention was given to it at the drafting of the final constitution.
Considering the drafting of the constitution, it's a big contention today amongst many academics, especially younger academics, and there are a few of the older and more critical minds who say that certainly the drafting of the constitution was a compromise, and that it compromised much, especially in terms of economic and social justice. So yes, there's been a political transformation, but we've had a political revolution in South Africa, not a social revolution. And of course, in terms of the political revolution, we've just handed over power, but the old systems continue. Do you feel, in a way, that when somebody looks at you and knows that you're part of this constitution and the drafting of the constitution, that you sold the country out, that there was a compromise?
No, well, firstly, especially with the second main constitution, it was made very clear to us by the politicians, to us. I was a professor then. My boss was Cyril Ramaphosa. It was made very clear to us that we are not drafting the constitution, the politicians do. That we must just write it down, technical, they were quite concerned, the politicians. They didn't want people to say that it was drafted by professors.
Okay.
And especially by foreign experts. But the politicians themselves are, of course, also opportunistic. When that process started, they wanted to write every detail the way they want. We just had to write it down.
To make it look legal. To sound legal.
Editing and so on. Yeah. We used a plain language approach. Right. We had a foreign expert. We sat through the night, and the text that came from the politicians, we edited.
Right.
But at the end, in order to reach compromises, they passed more and more. They also in the beginning said, we don't want the courts to write the constitution. It's our constitution, the politicians, the elected leaders. No professors, the courts must do what we tell them. The more they ran into difficulties, the more they phrased it vaguely, and said the courts can sort
Could
it out later.
interpret it, okay.
We, as a technical language team,
Yes.
sometimes in order to make something clearer, they would give you a text late at night and they would say, this is what they decided. And when we write it, we say, but it doesn't make sense.
No.
Do you mean this? Then they're all angry at us and they say we change it because now they cannot tell their own supporters that it means this. So I don't feel I was part of any sellout, but what I do think, of course, is necessarily it was a compromise. There's no question about it. But I think one must also be careful, and people like Ramaphosa said it, if one says, well, a Bill of Rights or protection of the right to life and dignity is a Western colonial concept. In other words, we must be careful not to insult the original people of this country, indigenous people, etc., by saying that concepts like fairness and equality and respect for human life was forced down on them. When it comes to the socio-economic level, there was a very great long debate about the socio-economic rights, but I can tell you people were very afraid on all across the spectrum, not only the conservative side. Very afraid of unintended consequences. Somebody who is very prominent in government now, a minister, specifically asked the question, how can we, the only right in the Constitution, for example, that is only for South African citizens is the right to vote. This very senior person was very cautious for us to write that the right to housing is the right of everyone in South Africa. We don't have right to housing, right of access to housing. She was very worried that this would mean that all the Zimbabweans and so on who were still to come would come and say, where's my house? So the politicians were very hesitant and very careful. Like I said, the first part, there was much more of a revolutionary spirit. The second part, there was...
Became much more conservative.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say conservative, but much more cautious, because they knew they were the ones who had to deliver now on these promises.
Okay, we have to go to the break. When we come back, I want to talk about something very important with regards to the writing of the Constitution, and that is about private property. We'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi, and welcome to the final segment of the second interview today on Finding Me in the ITV networks with my very special guest, and that is Justice Johan van der Westhuizen, a former Constitutional Court judge. Now, Judge, before we went on to the break, you were telling me about those different phases and the impact, and of course that you were just the writers of the Constitution, but the actual content came from the politicians. But what else impacted there?
What else impacted?
Yeah.
Well, let me also be honest, sometimes we were asked to research certain issues.
Right.
For example, one memo that we wrote was about the head of the public prosecution, the National Director of Public Prosecutions, whether it's part of the executive or part of the judiciary, etc. Those kinds of things we sometimes researched on. I would say that not necessarily conservative, but much more cautious with the final constitution, because people in power, if one wants to be cynical, you can say they want to stay in power, but if you want to be to open the door, give them benefit of the doubt, they are responsible for running the country and
Right.
for the law and for the fact that dangerous people must be locked up and so on. Selling out, I think I said when we started talking that things happen in phases. It is very seldom that there is a once-off revolution and everything changes. There are often second and third phases.
Yes.
Even the French Revolution was not the end of the process there. So Nelson Mandela apparently said to a colleague of mine who was close to him that I brought you political freedom, it's up to you to do the rest.
Wow.
So I don't think one can blame Mandela for everything from land to everything.
Yeah.
But what the Constitution should have done is to give the framework for later changes to happen.
So you think it didn't do that?
I think there's a lot more potential in it than has been used so far in the Constitution itself.
Because I see here that you say that the property clause does not guarantee the right to property. It guarantees the right not to be deprived arbitrarily of property. And you said that also you were surprised by the fact that all the time that you were on the Constitutional Court, that there was no case was brought forward with regards to the issue of land, or to test the arbitrary deprivation of land has still to be contested.
No, there were many, or let me first say, the property clause was perhaps the most difficult clause to draft.
But this is the one that is of greatest contestation, isn't it?
Yes,
because
Section
by
25.
by black consciousness, they feel that in a way protecting private property is to continue the apartheid legacy.
No, absolutely. Look, even before the drafting started, when we had conference and so on, young black people, they called themselves the young comrades at that stage, when the concept of a Bill of Rights and a constitution was new, they said, wait, you guys had the English parliamentary system for 300 years. What Parliament decided was law. Parliament decided to take away property, apartheid, all of that was so-called democratically decided, except that only 15% or whatever of people could vote. Now you say the courts can set aside laws made by Parliament and the courts will be able to set aside decisions of the president. Now who's the president going to be? It's going to be Nelson Mandela. Majority of people will be black. Now all of a sudden you want the courts to check it. Who are the courts? The courts at that stage were mainly old elderly white men. That's, by the way, one of the reasons why we created, or why our country created, a constitutional court, is to have a whole new court. And they appointed quite a number of people who were not judges before. So that, and then they would say, especially, what are you going to protect property? And what are you going to do about the socioeconomic rights? The fact that women in Limpopo have to carry water for 5 kilometers on their head, or firewood. You say freedom of expression. What does it mean to this auntie in Limpopo that you can see pornography in the State Theatre? What she wants is a hospital, water,
electricity,
etc. And that's where we realized the socio-economic rights had to be included. But one must be very careful that the socio-economic rights are not empty promises.
Yes.
Because if you say you must build houses, a certain number, and the government said we don't have enough money this year to build so many houses, they can just as well say we don't have money this year for an election. This has happened in other countries where the socio-economic part is used to also deflate the political part. But come back to property. The negotiation team from both sides, by the way, the ANC's experts were mostly white people, if I remember, but experts. Some of them are still professors and so on. The compromise there was not to protect property. So we do not, strictly speaking, have a right to property. We have a right not to be arbitrarily deprived of property. And then it's a very long clause, and it ends with stuff about mining rights and stuff like that. The debate now is, if you take money without compensation, is that arbitrary deprivation of property? Now, some academics say you can even, or he also talks of compensation, of course, but the compensation can be 1 cent, some people say.
It can be zero too.
Yeah, zero. I'm not so sure. I used to think that way, but I'm not so sure a court will accept that. A court will say, no, compensation can't be zero or whatever. So if that is the case, it will have to be amended. If it could be interpreted that all the potential is already there to redistribute land, then there is no real need to change it. And what I've seen in my interaction with students is when they keep saying amend it or scrap it, and you ask them, but exactly how should it read, then they're not always sure. So I think there is a political and emotional element involved in this, a symbolic element.
But ultimately,
let's write our own one, not the one that Mandela might have sold out.
But of course, there's also the question of political will. That, you know, if the political will is there, then you can get the academics, you can get the judges, you can get the legal culture,
absolutely.
Everything to change, isn't it? Because then
You know, the
it follows.
politicians also speak differently depending on what stage of their career.
Yes.
I chaired a conference here on land and property. My old friend from days in Germany, who was the ANC chief whip, who was very prominent, said repeatedly that there's nothing wrong with the Constitution. It is that their party lacked the political will to do something about it.
I would agree.
They were too slow. There are many things. The whole bureaucracy and all of that just did not happen.
I think there's a lack of political will on many issues, not just on the land issue.
That is possible.
We're coming very quickly to the end of the final segment, and I want to bring you right back again to the whole concept of decolonization and transformation. So you started out in the legal, as an academic, went into practicing law, into the highest court of the country, and you came back into the academic sphere. What is your understanding about this whole momentum that students have brought forward in terms of decolonization and transformation? Just as it is difficult to transform the legal institutions, the legal culture, there is an institutional mindset in the academic space in terms of academic integrity or academic freedom, but also in the management of academics. Do you find, or do you, in your short stint of the 2 years, do you think there is the potential for transformation, or are we still going to face very much of an uphill battle?
No, we're going to face an uphill battle. Let me just say something conservative again, and that is the law is inherently conservative. So it is in any other science, as soon as one can find something completely new, then you get a Nobel Prize. But in law, the law tends to rely on previous law. But of course, within that context, one must change. Talking about the academic world, it is going to be uphill. It is going to be difficult. I think I was a bit, much as I was positively impressed by many things, I was a bit disappointed with the level and style of debate. Quite frankly, my impression was that some senior academics are not used to robust, honest debate. The kind of debates that lawyers have all the time. But if I think of the Constitutional Court, we had some very hard debates. One stick to basic courtesy, so you don't call each other names or something. But I have had situations there where the Deputy Chief Justice, while he speaks, I would shake my head and he would say, "Don't shake your head, you're not the only expert." But if one asks somebody in an academic meeting, why do you laugh or pull faces, they start crying or they get angry. And
so it's too much. It's about fragility and emotion.
Yes, and it is
and playing the victim.
And people protect small territories, their field, So you must put all the human elements together when we talk about transformation. Some people are inherently worried about change because they worry about their own future and their children and their job and all of that. So we must find a way. Look, these ideas are not new. Decolonization, the debate has been going on, you would know better than I, but since the 1950s or whenever, with writers all over the world, Indian, Caribbean, African, and so on. One must make it a challenge, a positive challenge. An academic leader must be able to say to a faculty, let us do this, let us decolonize, let us transform in a responsible way so that we can be the leaders. Not put up your hands and say, sorry colleagues, the authorities tell us we must. I don't really know what they mean.
By must.
But we have to do it now. For me, that's the fallback situation, is to say, do your flippin' work. If you don't, but the ideal would be to make it a challenge, to say, I have a dream, and the dream is a legal system that functions, an academic world, but which is continuing to transform. We will never reach a stage where everybody is happy.
And we have to recognize that we all come with our own baggage, and that we're all influenced by our own social context, isn't it?
Yes, of course. We all come from somewhere. And by the way, the young academics criticizing Constitution, yes, I don't think there's anything wrong with being critical about the Constitution in an academic context. That's why we are there.
But you should offer something positive.
Well, one cannot tell students to say to a judge in court the Constitution is a sellout. The judge will chase you out of court and your client will be without a house that evening. So one must accept that the Constitution is the supreme law in a court. But in an intellectual environment, if theologians can argue whether there is a God or not,
We can argue.
lawyers must be able to argue whether the Constitution is correct.
But
or not.
ultimately, it's about looking at everything critically, and I think not stopping there is try to present something that will make a positive and a better change.
Yes, and critical thinking is extremely important. Recently, I had an expert witness. We asked, what should a lawyer be? He said three things. Number one is critical thinking. Number two is communication skills. And number three, ethics. One must be honest.
And I'm glad that you've left it on that. We have to end that. Thank you very much for being here. And I think that is perhaps the best advice and something that I have raised very many times about ethics, ethical behavior and honesty. Let's reflect on that. Fi amanillah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you.
قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في موت